Hey all, here at OS Reviews. Today we are taking a hands-on look at a budget mini retro game emulator. It goes by two names, which is a little interesting, either the LD300 or the Q90. It sells for about $35, so it's, again, very cost effective. In fact, it's almost half the price of the Retro Game 350 that we also did a review on a few months back. As the name implies, the 300 has a slightly smaller 3-inch display compared to the 3.5 inches of the RG350. For the money, you're also getting 16 gigs of storage via a micro SD card that's included. The blue model here really reminds me of a mini Nintendo Switch Lite. So you can also use it to play back music. It has a battery life rated at around 6 hours of usage. And here's a look of the transparent version, sells for the same cost. Box here is very simple and straightforward. Additional specs printed on the side, Q90, and it supports 64-bit operating systems. It supports kind of arcade-style games, Game Boy games, Sega games, so on and so forth. Has over 15 emulators built on in, and then inside we have just the unit itself. We have the blue edition we'll take a closer look at in a moment. Additional accessories here include a charging cable. It is using the modern USB Type-C, which is great to see, and also a quick user manual. So a closer look at the hardware here. There's a joystick which you can rotate in any direction. There's also plus and minus keys which can take you in and out of certain games and apps. We also have the controls, the typical A, B, X, and Y buttons, select and start. And then on the bottom here is where we have the micro SD card slot, a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, and then on the side here is a switch to turn the unit on or off. The top also features shoulder keys left and right that feel pretty tactile and responsive, and there's also the Type-C port for charging. On the rear here we do have stereo speakers, which do get fairly loud, and behind the battery cover is a removable, rechargeable battery. Although it's built entirely out of plastic, overall it does feel good enough considering the $35 price that it's being sold for. It feels decent. Here's a quick size comparison with the aforementioned Retro Game 350. The 350 here is going to be a bit larger in terms of the overall size, so this feels like a kind of miniaturized version. So if we switch it on, you can see that it starts to boot up. It's not using the kind of Dingo OS like the RG350, but it does still run on kind of a Linux-based operating system. We can see that it's running on something called G-Menu-UX. We still use the shoulder keys to basically slide left and right between various screens. The first screen here shows some basic utility tools, things like file managers. You can also see some notes apps in addition to media players for music and videos. You can see there's going to be a few tracks that you can then tap on play. It will just begin playing back. The interface though is very primitive. Certain apps may take advantage of different buttons to go back, such as using the select key sometimes using the A and X keys, sometimes using the minus key. It may take a bit of time to get used to what the controls correspond to on some of these other apps. We also have an interesting emulator called WQX, and that's emulating a basic organizer or a PDA of some sort, but it's very obscure. It's not really a Palm PDA or anything that we've seen before. It's in Chinese, but what we are able to do is kind of use it to see a calendar. You can see it kind of changes the display to almost resemble a more retro style monochrome transflective screen, so it's kind of cool in that way, but it basically is just a calendar, and basic functions like a calculator can also be found here. We also have a very basic file manager that you can find also here. Next tab over is really where the games start. We've also got the aforementioned NES emulators, and to go back here we tap on the start button to go back one page. We've got one here for Pico Drive games, which can be found, and other ones here we have Neo Geo Pocket. Here's one for PlayStation 1 titles, which is pretty cool. Once more here for a Wonder Swan emulator. And we also have some arcade-style games, which is interesting because the interface also looks a little different. With the arcade titles that you see in kind of older arcade machines, we also get a cover art display on the side as we're scrolling down, which is interesting. We'll take a closer look at those and do a demo in a moment, but the next tab over, we also get a list of more homebrew style / proprietary games, not originally designed for exclusive console, but you can still find online, and that's been put into the system's memory for it to play back. So examples here include Quake. There's Quake 1 and 2. And finally on the right here is we can take a look at the settings. We can actually change the clock speed for the processor and even kind of overclock or underclock it, which is pretty cool that you can access this directly. But you can see that it can go upwards of 900 megahertz. We can tap on the start again to go back by one page. Skin allows us to change the wallpaper, so you can go and select some different color options. Again, the display does a pretty decent job in terms of viewing angles and the colors that we're seeing here. Alright, so now let's take a closer look at some of these games here. I'll do a quick demo of some Game Boy Advance titles, Pokemon Firered, and you can see that the loading speeds are actually quite fast. It's playing back and all the keys are being calibrated without any problems. All the keys, again, are correctly mapped to work here out of the box without any real problems. And it gives you a quick tutorial as well. So all of this is pretty famous dialogue by now, and the keys themselves do feel pretty responsive and tactile. The four-way directional pad does feel maybe slightly stiff at first, but you can quickly get used to it. And then the buttons themselves don't feel too shabby in terms of being quite clicky, not feeling too cheap. We would take a look at additional settings. That's a part of the emulator by tapping on the minus key here. And what we can do here is take a look at our different options, such as saving our current game status to one of the built-in memory slots, so that the next time that we launch into this game, it can keep us in the same save state. There's even quote-unquote sheets, so for certain games, maybe there's a code that you can enter to unlock certain things that you can also enter, and the emulator does support. Overall, the gameplay experience is actually quite good in terms of the playback. It's relatively fast and smooth. It makes it pretty robust. The ability for you to easily save, exit out of games, in addition to, again, enter in any additional controls. And again, the dialogue is, I think, rendering at a pretty fast speed. The processor is more than sufficient to keep up, even though it's not as powerful as on the more expensive GPD XD, for example. But all of these older consoles and games, which are from a decade or two ago, have been optimized to run pretty smoothly, even on hardware like this. A few of the other games and titles built in as part of the 3000 built-in ROMs. Here's one for Sonic that's still using Game Boy Advance, but it again runs pretty well. And again, it's definitely more than playable. Everything is still a very enjoyable experience. Some other classics on here include some Kirby games. There's also a Dragon Ball game. Donkey Kong can also be found here, and there's even Crash Bandicoot. Even with the Game Boy Advance, the animations are still performing pretty well as far as looking quite similar in terms of to the PlayStation edition of the game. Controls and everything also works quite well. And again, another fun title to play around with levels that progress and get harder and harder. There's even Legend of Zelda, which is built on in here. Mega Man is also here. Final Fantasy games. The Sims, you also have a version here for Game Boy Advance. Some of the other consoles now, such as Game Boy Color, we have additional versions of Pokemon. Some of the earlier ones, like Gold, Silver, Yellow, Crystal, and if we tap on one, for example, we can see it still gives us a full screen experience, and still is pretty enjoyable, quite similar in terms of the playability to the GBA emulators that we saw there. Original Game Boy emulator, which we can see here, that's going to be in monochrome black and white. So if we start a game here, it's still going to be full screen, but it's going to be in a black and white kind of experience. Still is quite good though in terms of the overall gaming experience. Still feels pretty easy to control and fun to play back. Here we have a PlayStation 1 game that's been loaded on here, and it's, I think, a Resident Evil game. It still works quite well. The graphics here are going to be a little bit nicer than some of the Game Boy games, since those were a bit more heavily compressed in terms of the ROMs, since even the original screen of the Game Boy wasn't really high resolution. These games do take a little bit longer to load. Some of the frame rates are a little bit slower than on the Game Boy Advance. Once it loads, though, the majority of the games are still going to play back fairly smoothly. But again, it's going to be pretty impressive graphically, but also a bit more demanding on the processor. Some of the ported games or slightly more homebrew style, such as Quake 2 that we see here, this is just a quick kind of demo of it, but it still is relatively easy to play back and still feels fairly smooth once the games are loaded, and we still get a pretty nice experience as we are playing along, not too many drop frames here, which is pretty impressive to look at. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Q90/LD300 mini retro game emulator. And again, for the price of only $35, I think it remains a pretty strong value-oriented option that is, again, half the price of the RG350, but has very similar functionality in terms of supporting music playback, video playback. In addition, the games and emulators that you can choose from is almost identical to that one as well. You're not really missing out on anything. And the RG350 is commonly cited as one of the best retro emulators that you can find, so I think that this is going to be an even better value if you can make do with a slightly smaller screen size. You want something a little bit more compact, as long as you're not expecting support for the newest systems like Nintendo's 3DS, for example. But aside from that, it does a great job. You can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Q90 Mini Retro Emulator Handheld.